Podcast number 5.
Number 5.
We are trucking along.
Slowly but surely.
Slowly but surely trucking along. So if you've listened to any of the podcasts, you may or may not have picked up on kind of the format that we're following, just because we're new to this whole thing, which is we're going to try every week to have a guest on once a week is our goal. That
Right.
may not always happen. But then in the week, we're also going to do a podcast with just me and Eric. Because one, it's, I guess, fun to do, right?
Yep.
But secondly, I think that as we continue to talk to people, maybe this is a little bit egotistical, but I just feel like the people that listen, the more they get to know us, the better it will be
Yeah.
for them, the better the experience.
Come full circle.
Yeah. So yeah, our last guest was our mom, and she told us the story of the kind of series and sequence events in the life of our grandfather, and ultimately led to his suicide. So if you haven't listened to podcast number 4, listen to it because it's really good, and I think we both learned a lot of stuff we didn't know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, and I did mention in the last podcast, which I can't say I've ever met anyone. Of course, you don't sometimes get into these kind of details of people's lives, but have you ever met anyone who's had both their grandfathers commit suicide?
I've personally never met anybody, no.
I'm sure it's out there.
Oh, yeah.
A ton, but we have.
Yep.
Both our grandfathers committed suicide years and years apart. So what's interesting is we discovered in the last podcast is you were right around the age I was when our dad's dad took his life.
Right.
Because we decided you were around 7.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Which is around the age that I was.
Yep.
But kind of going over that podcast with, I made some notes here with our mom, kind of made me remember some things or made me think of some things. And since we did it, I've been kind of thinking, and, because like I'm a big believer in the fact that you can't really trust memory.
Right.
Like eyewitness testimony is worthless and stuff like that. But you still have your memories, know?
Right.
And so as we were talking, I honestly thought I was older a couple years older when he took his life. And when Mom said I was 6, I was like, it made me kind of question some of the memories that I had. So and it made me question, was I really close to my grandpa?
Is that a real memory?
Is it a real memory? Was I really close to him? Because it's like, how are those concepts really there when you're 6 years old?
Right.
Right. But as I've grown up, or as I grew up, I always felt close to him. And it all stems around from that, just all the time. Every time I went there, we'd go out in the field and rockhound. That's basically it.
That's
and
cool.
I'm sure we'll go out in the junk shed and stuff like that. But what it did make me think of is kind of the overall impact as an adult that had on my life.
All these years later.
Yeah, and it's something that always, I think, was in the back of my head.
Right.
Always in the back of my head. I remember, I'm going to tell a quick little story here that to me is very pertinent story.
Mm-hmm.
That happened to me, a sequence of events and actions that I took as an adult that kind of led from one thing to the other, and I'll get to that. But I can remember when I first moved to Utah, and I was about to be a new dad, and so, or I think maybe by this time I was a new father. I was coming from being a fairly active young person in growing up in the LDS church. And so I kind of had these questions about things because I wasn't really buying into or drinking the Kool-Aid as much anymore. And so I think that's the time when and I was probably, 24 or so, 25, somewhere in that range. And I remember thinking about, Grandpa a lot and kind of what he meant to me and kind of how he shaped some of my, the way I saw things.
Sure, yeah.
And so anyway, this is how the story goes. So because my grandfather committed suicide, which is an intriguing and interesting thing in and of itself. And if you listen to the podcast, you know the circumstances of how he did it are really quite interesting.
Pretty unique.
Pretty unique. That's the right word. So I always kind of had this question about, that process. And more so, as silly as it sounds, is the state of mind to take your life that way. And then what happens afterwards. Not here, but whatever the next level or life is.
Right.
And without going in, because everyone's got their opinion and nobody really knows. And I think that's, to me, the best thing about it.
That's the beauty of it.
You get to just decide.
Yep.
You can just decide.
Yep.
So
it is what you want it to be.
Yeah, and I'm sure as podcasts go on, we'll probably get into that more. But it was around that time that here in Salt Lake, one of the local radio stations during Halloween would always have an episode. They would sometimes do it multiple days in a row, and they would have one of the more prominent or one of the longer running paranormal teams in Utah come on the radio and play EVP. And EVP stands for Electronic Voice Phenomenon, which is basically the idea on a very simple level that you're recording ghosts, that you're getting audio of ghosts. Right. And so whether that's some sort of conscious entity that is saying something, or it's an echo from the past or whatever, that not really the point of this conversation, but every year this episode would be on, and I remember them always commenting that it was one of their, during that time of year, was their highest rated shows, right? Because everyone's kind of fascinated with that.
Yeah.
And the group that would come on was out of Ogden, and I remember one time they played a recording that was over 30 seconds long, and it was way intense. It was
that the bathroom drowning one?
The sound of water splashing.
That one's creepy.
Someone, what it sounded like, gasping for air. Someone muttering the word
chills.
Murder on there. It was, at the time, I think was one of the longest EVPs recorded, and it was recorded up in the old Exchange building up in Ogden.
Right.
Anyway, fascinating stuff. So for a few years, I'd listen to that show, and some of those audio files, all recorded here in Utah, were kind of burned into my brain. Okay, fast forward a couple years, and I am on a date, and went to see the movie White Noise.
All right.
Okay, with Michael Keaton.
Yep, I remember.
And it's about EVP.
Yeah.
And my only reference to EVP was this radio program that I'd heard a few times during Halloween. Well, actually, I didn't go see the movie White Noise. Let me back up. I went to see the movie The Notebook with this girl.
Oh, well, that's a way different story.
Way different story. But they played the trailer for White Noise. And we're sitting there watching the trailer. I'm like, oh, this seems pretty interesting. I know what EVP is. And in the trailer, they play an EVP that is from this paranormal team that was recorded at Capitol Theater, downtown Salt Lake. I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was like a 3 or 4 word EVP, but I instantly recognized it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next day I called up Bill. We talk about Bill a lot. Bill's our uncle, close to us in age, so more like a brother. But I called up Bill and I said, hey, let's see if we can record a ghost, right? Just this whim of a thing. Long story short, we got into doing paranormal investigations, and being super inquisitive people, we kind of immersed ourselves in that. And it quickly spun out of just being about ghost hunting. And then we got very interested in and I'm using air quotes here, in the science behind it. How does this phenomenon happen? What makes it happen? Can you control the phenomenon happening? Can you affect your environment to make the phenomenon happen in different ways? And so we learned a lot and got really nerded out by it. Okay. So we were heavily engaged in learning the subject, and then doing silly, stupid shit like going to a cemetery and recording, right? Finding an abandoned house and going in there, trespassing to record, right? But as we were learning about the subject matter, and obviously we had the internet to kind of feed the fire, we learned about something called ITC, which is instrumental transcommunication. And without going into the details of how real it is or whatever, the concept is that there were a lot of quote unquote researchers out there, paranormal researchers, that instead of recording ghosts, what they're trying to do is they're trying to specifically engage and capture in an audio format the voice of a loved one or whatever, that there's communication going on, that a question is asked and that question is then answered.
Right.
Okay. And we had a lot of success with recording EVP and stuff because of some of the methods and techniques we developed at the time and found real interesting. Now, through this whole time frame, we had all these really crazy coincidences happening. Okay. But the primary drive behind the scene for me as we learned about ETC was, can I make communication with Grandpa? Right? That was a big driving force for me. So I tried every technique under the sun, right? While we're doing the ghost hunting thing, and pretty soon it sounds so cheesy, but making a name for ourselves, and we're getting access to places that are known to be haunted and stuff like that. And it inevitably ended up being on a show on the Discovery Channel called A Haunting, which is a recreation show where they over embellish things and stuff, but it's still an interesting thing. It was based on a house we investigated in the avenues of Salt Lake. So that being said, learning about ITC, and I'm very interested in making communication with Grandpa, right? Because I've heard some EVP, some ITC communication from other people.
Mm-hmm.
I've learned a lot about it. I read some very interesting books, and there's all these different techniques and methods that people talk about, and some of them are really, really old techniques that go back to Egyptian times and things like that. One of the techniques is called scrying. And
what is scrying?
Scrying, it's been a long time since I've been into this, so this might not be accurate. I might be confusing two things, but let's just say it's scrying. I think scrying can involve a mirror, but basically the idea here is that you want to hold an object that belonged to the person you're trying to communicate in your hand tightly as you're falling asleep while you have a recorder running. Okay? And the idea is that as you start to fall asleep, your brain goes through different, brainwave patterns. You go to different states, alpha waves, theta waves, beta waves, stuff like that. And so the idea is that as your grip loosens, the idea is that it starts to wake you up a little bit, and then you come back in and you potentially ask some questions as you're starting to fall asleep and stuff like that. Okay, so I read this concept in a book, and I'm like, I want to try this because I've been trying everything else. And so I had a scarf that belonged to our grandpa that he knitted himself while he was in the hospital. I believe he was injured. I don't know that he was wounded. He was hurt somehow during World War II, and he was in the hospital for a week or so, and he learned to knit, and he knitted this cool black and red scarf, right? And years and years ago, before all this paranormal stuff and whatever, I came to acquire the scarf from Mom because she had it in a box of stuff, and I was like, what's this? And she's like, that belonged to your grandfather, and she gave it to me. Okay, so I went looking for this scarf because I knew I had it somewhere. Couldn't find it. And that's where that story pauses for a second. Back up a couple years before that, and I am dating. I meet this girl that I start dating. I'm hanging out, going to her house and stuff like that. And a very weird kind of coincidental small world thing happens, right? I'm at her apartment downtown Salt Lake. We are flipping through a photo album. She's showing me some pictures of some friends and family, and I stop her on one of the pages, and I look at this picture. It's like a picture of a bunch of people sitting at a table. There's some people in the background or whatever, and I see two people I recognize in the background, right? Which is at the time my ex-wife and her ex-husband, right? So the husband she had before I married her.
Right.
Okay. Who happened to be a girl who was a longtime family friend. Our families have been friends for years. So I say, "Oh, you know them?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, I do know them. I know, this guy's name is Jason." She's like, "I know Jason, and I've, hung out with him and his wife many times." I'm like, "Well, that's a weird coincidence."
Yeah.
Right? Just kind of that small world kind of thing.
For sure.
And we dated for a while, and it kind of pittered out or whatever. Didn't last very long. And so that's that. Well, fast forward two or 3 years. I can't even remember how long it was. 2 or 3 years later, when I'm looking for this scarf, okay, and I'm looking all over the place. I can't find it, and I think to myself, well, maybe somehow Mom got it back, and it's with her, okay. So I call her up and I say, hey, do you know where that scarf of Grandpa's is? Because I want to try something with this. And she says, I haven't seen it in years. You have it. You had it. And I'm like, I don't know where it is. So I'm kind of, I'm upset on 2 levels. One, because I can't try this technique I want to try with this thing that had this emotional kind of connection that I formed with it. And I think that's more about what the scrying's about, is you as the individual, not so much the other person you're trying to communicate with. Anyway, and given at this time, I'm very skeptical. We always took a very skeptical approach to things. So I call Mom. She doesn't have it, and I'm kind of irritated and upset by it. And at the time, my youngest daughter, Layla, I think she's about 3 years old, right? So Mom went ahead and she gave me this kind of clipping book that had a bunch of newspapers clipping about, Grandpa's death and all this stuff.
Right.
Had some pictures of him and things like that. The next day, after I'd called Mom and asked her if she had seen the scarf, okay, that morning, I had left that book out, and a little newspaper cutout piece. It was a picture of Grandpa wearing this, I wouldn't call it a cowboy hat, but it was this kind of weird hat. And Layla, newly talking but speaking in full sentences, she sees the picture, and I haven't talked to her about him at all or whatever. I don't have any pictures of him up. She says, I know him. Right?
No way.
Yeah, she goes, I know him. And I'm like, how do you know him? She's like, I don't know. She's like, I can't remember the exact.
Like a 3-year-old would.
Yeah. She's like, whatever. And I'm like, well, that's your great grandpa. And she's like, oh, whatever. Yeah. So that happens in the morning. A little bit later that day, Mom calls me. And she says, I'll never forget it. She says, you're not going to believe what just walked through the front door. And I'm thinking, what just walked through the front door? You mean who just walked through the front door? And I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, I have your grandpa's scarf. And I'm like, oh, you found it? She's like, no, your sister brought it. She just brought it. She just came by and she just dropped it off. And I'm like,
what? Well, how did she get it?
Exactly. So I run over there and I grab it because I'm like, sweet. It's been, I haven't seen it in years.
Right.
I thought it was in a box, whatever. So I call up our sister and I say, how did you get this scarf? And she's like, my neighbor gave it to me.
What?
Yeah. My neighbor, when she lived out in
Saratoga Springs. No.
Yeah. And so I'm like, when did you get it? She's like, oh, yesterday. Okay. What? The day I asked Mom for it, it comes into her possession. Her neighbor gives it to you. And I'm like, well, who's your neighbor? And she goes, oh, her name is, I'm going to use a different name just because it's a weird story. Her name's Karen. Right. And I'm like, well, what's her last name? So she gives me her married last name. Okay. Turns out it's the girl that I dated years ago. Okay. I apparently left it at her apartment. I was wearing it and had left it at her apartment years before. And I'm talking years before, where she's now married, has a kid, right? So I say, well, how long have you known her? She's like, I don't know, like a year. And I'm like, well, what? And she goes, we were outside talking and we were talking about this and that. And I brought up your name, and she never realized my maiden name. And I brought up my brother Jeremy, and I had told her, I think a couple days before, my maiden name. And she goes, is your brother Jeremy Spencer? And our sister says, yeah. And they're literally next door neighbors. Okay. And she says, I have something that I've been holding on to for a while that I think was kind of important to him, and you give it back to him. So Jenny says she runs in the house, that Karen runs in the house and grabs the scarf and says, here. And at the time, and our sister has no clue what the scarf is, what its importance is, or any of that stuff.
Right.
So she goes And she gets the scarf and gives it to Jenny, and Jenny just happened to be coming up to Mom's house the next day. Gives it to, so this all happens within essentially a 24-hour period, right? And when I hear this story, I'm like, holy shit. Like it sends up all these bells and whistles, and I'm like, that's
a universal thing.
Too random of a coincidence, right?
No coincidence.
Exactly. So then, and I was recently through this whole time frame, I'd been recently divorced and all this crap. So I was, I was doing a lot of different stuff. I was in the paranormal stuff or whatever, and meeting a lot of different new people.
Yeah.
And a little added story to this is that I'm working at an internet company, and to be honest with you, I'd have to think about it, but I met a girl, just platonically. I met someone through someone else, through MySpace. That's how I met.
MySpace.
So I was trolling on MySpace, and I came across a page of this girl who I thought was gorgeous, and I tried to hit her up on MySpace. That's the story. The girl I'm talking about isn't the girl I was trying to hook up with or get to, talk to me. It was her friend. And I can't remember. It was chatting with this girl online, so the girl I'm talking about, she claimed to be a medium. Okay. She's like, oh, I'm friends with Becca. And she says you've been chatting with her and whatever. And so she just pinged me. I didn't know her. I'd never met her. I never met in person the other girl. She just pings me, right? And she's like, oh, hey, blah, blah, I'm friends with Becca. I'm like, okay. Like, I'm thinking, why are you talking to me?
Yeah.
So come to find out years later, there's obviously a reason. So I just start talking to her, while I'm working, you're bored. I'm chatting with this girl, and the other girl, she wasn't really giving me the time of day. And I start to tell her how we're into the paranormal stuff and whatnot. And eventually she says, oh, I'm a medium. And I instantly am skeptical because I'm very, we always took a very skeptical approach, and I don't know what's real and what's not real. Over the years, became pretty good friends with her. And over the years was pretty convinced by her quote unquote ability. But I'd never seen this girl's face. Her name was Lindsay. Okay. Never seen her face. And I'm sure I'm leaving out obviously a bunch of the details and stuff, but I start to talk about what got me into the paranormal, which is Grandpa, right? And I'd already known for a few days of conversations that she was a medium. And she says, I don't want to weird you out, but I have something for you. This is after the scarf thing. I have something for you that your grandpa wants you to have.
Hold on, you're gonna have to give me a second here. Let my body catch up. My whole just chills down my whole body.
Yeah. I see. What's weird is this is where the 311 thing came from. Was from her,
right?
Around the same time,
right?
We'll talk about that in some future podcasts. But so she says, "I have something for you from your grandpa," and I'm like, "What?" Well, yeah, but more so, I'm like, you crazy son of a bitch. You're a knock.
You're bad shit.
And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she continues to explain. Now, mind me, this is over Messenger chat. Okay?
Right.
She proceeds to explain to me that sometimes she has this little wooden box on her nightstand, and sometimes her quote unquote friends, which is her code for spirit guides, all this stuff.
Right.
Leave gifts. Okay. Now, this is in the beginning of social media and stuff like that. So your MySpace page, it wasn't like Facebook.
No.
Where you could get a lot of information. Because I was very skeptical. And I had not told anyone any of this stuff. Okay. And I know there's a bunch of people listening going, oh, they're just really good at this and that. But remember, never seen her face to face, never met her. Talked briefly about what got me into my grandpa. And she says, I got a gift for you. So she claims, before she shows me the gift, she claims that this little gift was left behind in her box. And it was a message from my grandfather. Something just struck me that's really poignant. It's giving me goosebumps right now. At the time, my oldest daughter, stepdad, had committed suicide by cop. Got involved pretty heavily in some drugs, was pretty strung out. Cop showed up one time and he just lunged at him with a knife. They shot him. It was all this and that. So my daughter was struggling with this because she was like 8 years old at the time. So she says to me, he wants you to know that everything's going to be okay with your daughter. Okay. And
Wow.
I'm like, wow. And she's like, and he left a gift, quote unquote gift to, let you know that this is real. And I'm thinking, you are crazy.
This lady's nuts.
So I said, well, what is it? And she's like, well, I can show you. And she says, give me a minute to hook up my webcam and I'll show you. She turns on her webcam. It's facing down on a dresser. She's moving the camera around. And I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be a doozy, whatever this is. The camera turns on. She doesn't put it on her face. I don't even know, except for a profile picture,
right.
what this girl even looks like. And camera is jostling around, and it comes rotating around. And on this little nightstand is a little geode, right?
Right.
Which is some of the kind of stone we used to look for.
Right.
As soon as I see that rock, for whatever reason, you call it actual gift or weird coincidence or whatever, as soon as I see that rock, this just feeling comes over me. And I instantly know, like she said I would, that it was some sort of message. Right? Like, oh, everything is going to be okay. So, that was the second thing related to, Grandpa. Because the question I was always after is, what happens to someone who commits suicide?
Sure.
Mm-hmm. If you believe in some sort of afterlife or raising of energy or whatever, what happens? You know what I mean? Because it's always a big question of mine. So when Mom was telling the story about Grandpa and whatnot, it kind of brought all that rushing back. And to be honest with you, that's probably 5% of the level of coincidental stories that just started to erupt around one, Grandpa, two, just the stuff that we were getting into in the series and sequences of events that eventually led to us being interviewed for a show on the Discovery Channel.
Right.
So anyway, so yeah, it was obviously it's something that's years gone by, and it inevitably evolved into kind of a different approach than just ghost hunting. We stopped doing ghost hunting and looked more at the science behind it, at the phenomenon behind it, and things like that. But yeah, so when Mom told that story, was telling her story about Grandpa, man, all that stuff just came rushing back, because, and inevitably, I do believe that some of the EVP I got was that specific, instructions was there. The other portion of the story is that it was right around the same time that, my oldest daughter's stepfather had died. Right. And she was pretty close to him, and he was a big part of her life for a long time, and then he went astray and died. And at the time, the whole thing about Grandpa was that the message was that he was there looking after her. Okay. Well, this whole ITC stuff, and I don't know if even this, but Bill and I were doing some stuff, and we started to actually work with my daughter's mom, and because she had questions and whatnot, right? Mm-hmm. So we were doing experimentation, what we called experimentation to record audio. We were trying these different methods and stuff like that. Long story short, one time we had a very clear message that said, "Help me talk to Jennifer," which was my daughter's mom's name. And we were specifically asking to speak with Steven and stuff like that. So for anyone listening who knows me, knows that's something that I was into and stuff like that. But everyone kind of just knows the surface of like the ghost hunting. Right. Because we've been on the news, news a couple times. But the deep stuff was that stuff. Like hearing that, getting the chills all around the same time, trying to communicate with Grandpa. Having this lady pop up out of the blue in my life saying, "Oh, I got a message for you." So it just kind of begs the question, but kind of where I was going with this, and before the podcast, you and I were talking a little bit, and you had just mumbled the phrase, say it again, because now I'm forgetting it. It was something about your actions.
You question your actions.
Question your actions. When you said it, I know you weren't implying this, but because I'm writing down kind of some notes about the story I'm going to tell about Grandpa, right? And it's just a trip to me that I have this scarf. This scarf isn't even like, I think back when I was wearing it.
Is that the red and black one that's like
It's only no. It's a very small. It's not a
I think I
practical
remember
scarf.
that thing. Yeah.
It's not a practical scarf at all. It's hanging up in my closet now. Uh, but yeah, you've seen it. I guarantee
Yeah.
you've seen it. But that I leave this scarf. I just happened to leave this scarf at a girl's house that I casually dated for maybe a month, right? And then years later. So when you said question your actions, it's like, what am I to think?
Right.
That on some level, I left that scarf because
Dude.
if I didn't leave that scarf there, the sequence of actions that led to this thing of, oh, here's the scarf a day later that you asked for, ask and you shall receive
Yeah.
kind of shit. You know, it's like, was that action predetermined? Was it whatever? So anyway, when you said question your actions,
It's so crazy. Like my eyes are watering up. Just
right,
the beauty in it all. Of
right,
there are no accidents. And I'm a believer in everything happens for a reason, and you may not know that reason for years down the road as you have experienced.
years.
But holy crap, it's just too beautiful, too perfect to be an accident.
Well, and what's weird is like those things happen to you. I know most people listening to this probably have a story if they think about it that
Oh, yeah.
is maybe not similar, but is one of those powerful like, whoa, this is not a coincidence,
Right.
And it makes and I always question this idea. That was a very powerful thing that happened to me, and it kind of shaped my thinking about death and all this stuff, right?
Mhm.
Which we don't need to go into, but as powerful as that was, it's like when time goes by, you kind of forget about it. You might think about it from time to time, but you definitely lose
You do.
the emotional power of it, which is part of the human condition.
Yeah.
Like
You become complacent.
Right. Is it complacency?
At the end of the day, I think it is. If it's not, front and center, it takes a back seat.
Right.
And loses attention and loses focus.
Regardless of how important it was.
Right. Absolutely.
So, since we're on the subject of things that we've done before that seem to have no bearing on our lives in general, but then all of a sudden, one day has this connect the dots thing. And before I ask you this question, I will make the statement that what was interesting about that happening, the whole rock thing and all that stuff, was that it made me start to really pay attention to and look at how connected things are personally.
Right.
One thing leading to another that led to another that led to another. When I started to look back, I went, oh, wow. When I did this when I was 16, this thing I got into, it was exactly the thing that led to this, that led to that, which is life in general.
Right.
But it seems very, I don't want to say predetermined, because I don't really know that I believe in predetermination or whatever the word is. But when you said question your actions, I know you weren't talking about
No.
those kind of actions.
No.
What were you talking about?
Oh. I was just talking about as a practice in general, which I'm not very good at the moment, but more in the short term of things, questioning your actions as far as, if I do or say this, what will the, maybe not consequence, but reaction be?
Mm-hmm.
How it will be perceived, how it will be taken. What are the consequences of choosing this action versus not? And just on a daily basis, in a daily practice, questioning those thoughts and those actions before you do them, before you take them, consciously living.
So you just said two things there. Question those thoughts and those actions. But those are two distinctly different things, right? So do you question the thought?
Well, initially, because the thought happens first.
But do you question it in a judgmental kind of way?
No.
Like, oh man, I can't believe
No,
I
shouldn't be having that thought. No, because you're having the thought. Don't deny the thought.
Right.
But just question maybe where it comes from. And that's kind of ties back into the grandpa thing the other day, in the last episode, is For me, not knowing Grandpa, never having met him, Mom being pregnant with me,
Right.
before when he died, and not knowing much about the guy, to be honest with you,
Right.
and just hearing her talk about who he was as a man and as a person and so on, it brought a little bit of clarity to me as to why maybe some of the traits I have, and I fully believe some of them I've got from him,
Right.
and questioning maybe why the way we are. And so your thoughts, well, why am I having this thought? Not
Right.
Don't label it good or bad, but why am I having this thought? Where does it take me? Okay, well, if it takes me here, what are the consequences? Just and so on, and just
So
question it all.
a little bit of what I don't think you're talking about this, but this is an interesting concept. What it makes me think of, because I think a little bit of what you're referring to, you could classify, which this isn't necessarily an accepted thing, but is the idea of like genetic memory, right?
Hmm.
Is that certain things are passed down, because I think one of the more simpler things we talked to is that he was kind of a clean, I wouldn't say a clean freak, but was very
Organized and
organized
orderly.
about
Yeah,
being,
for
every
sure.
Saturday the house gets cleaned and
Right.
whatnot. We know
Yep.
how mom is that way, and
Yep.
you and I are both kind of that way. We don't like
Yep.
messes and things like that, which is always kind of the running. We always tease mom about, or it was a real pain in the ass when we were kids. But then we end up being the same way.
Naturally.
I mean, I've had you call me mom before, right? At my house doing something and being like,
Sometimes.
but yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of interesting, right? Because that kind of falls along the lines of those what we were talking about, just between you and I about those kite strings,
Yeah.
right? So you're talking about questioning where the thought comes from, questioning what you is it more about questioning what you are going to maybe say, or is it about questioning more about what you're going to do in an action,
Well,
or both?
we tend to act at an impulse on a lot of things, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's saying something or doing something. But there's a great value in being able to stop beforehand and think about it, you
Of
know,
course.
and then make an informed decision, because too much like our past with the conditioning, with genetic memory,
Right.
possibly, you know, we just react.
Yeah.
We just do without really knowing why or where it comes
It's
from.
like the blinders thing.
Right.
Right.
And so it's just kind of been a recent practice to try and question everything in a way.
So let me ask you this, because when you mentioned that, it made me think of the way I kind of think about what you're saying. And would you say that as it becoming something that's a practice, which I agree is a pretty good, it's just like, think about things before you say them.
Yeah, I
This
mean,
is
it's
pretty
the old
common.
saying,
Yeah.
think before you talk.
Think before you speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. But do you find, or have you found that uh, questioning those actions is not delaying, but it hesitates you on your decision making?
Which can be a good thing in and of itself.
Right.
It allows that space before something's done, and then you may just not. You may go, "Oh yeah, that was a good thing. I didn't do that or say that or take that step or whatever it is.
Right.
Good thing I allowed for that space for a moment."
Okay, so I think like in anything, because here's what I think about that. Everything in what's the phrase? Um,
Moderation.
there you go. Everything in moderation. That's the word I was looking
Yeah.
for. Even on something like that, right? Because do you think that at a point that I, I I I'm not this way, for better or for worse, probably for worse, but I know a lot of people that they question so much so that they almost don't take action, right?
Sure.
Because they can't make a decision. I call them fence riders, which I don't think is a very
Well, those are the people, in my opinion at least, those are the people that, like they say, even no action is a choice. Even no action is an action.
right.
And knowing that, I think is a huge help too.
Right.
I don't know. Just my opinion.
Knowing what? No.
Knowing that your lack of choice is a choice.
Yeah.
Your decision not to make a choice, decision not to act, is your decision.
Right. I personally think though is that it can become I don't, maybe a crutch is not the right word, but like I think
It's a handicap.
I think it is very mentally stressful to not be able to make a decision. If it's one thing to contemplate what your decision's going to be and what it is and look at the pros and cons, I think that's all great. But if that hesitation to make a decision is causing anxiety,
Oh yeah.
causes you stress, you're just better off making a decision. That's where that whole flip the coin thing comes from.
Yeah, for sure.
Which
Which
is
I do on a daily basis.
Flip the coin.
Yep.
Okay, so this is a great exercise, right? So when you can't decide something, flip a coin, right? Whatever the two decisions are, you go heads, tails, whatever. But here's the trick. One, it sounds cheesy, but fully commit to the coin. The coin is God. The coin will make the decision, right?
Yep.
And we'll and I want to make sure we're on the same page with this. But the trick is, you can go about it two ways because I've done it both ways. Is flip the coin and you do whatever the coin says. Okay, but the real exercise is this.
Yep.
If the coin, pay attention to your immediate emotional response to whether that coin lands on heads or tails.
Mm-hmm.
If that coin lands on tails and you have the immediate thing of disappointment, then you know the other option is the way you should go.
Yep.
So if you land on tails and you're like, okay, and you don't have that disappointment, then that's probably the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a great exercise. I always wanted to do an exercise where every bigger decision I made through the course of a week was made by the flip of the coin. And regardless of what I emotionally thought, I would just follow what the coin said.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. If you can't make a decision about something and you're on the fence and you're hemming and hawing, then you might as well just flip a coin.
You may as well. Forget
just
the
the
stress.
same
Forget the anxiety
just
of it
flip
all.
a coin and let a coin decide.
How much mental energy that takes in. Wow. Wipes you out.
Yeah. I mean, it totally wipes you out.
Wipes you out.
I mean, and they've done, everyone's heard it, but, they've done studies that show that, the brain doesn't know the difference. They've done it with athletes.
Yeah.
Athletes visualizing, hooked up to, EEG machines and all that fancy stuff. And they're going through the thought process of the prep of, let's say, a sprinter and how, it's being
Running
in the
their
blocks
race in
and
their
running this
mind.
race.
Yeah.
And the brain reacts the same way.
The exact same way.
So as far as the brain's concerned, the brain is doing it already. Okay. And if you buy into the concept that, the brain's a machine and a machine is eventually going to wear out and run down, then you are wearing out your gears just on the mental masturbation of it.
Yep.
So yeah. So that's the long way to where my thoughts went when you said question your actions. Because my first response instinctively in my head as I was writing was, no, don't question your actions. Just trust your instincts. Right? But I think there's a happy medium.
No, there is.
Like in all things.
Yeah. It's an ebb and flow. It's a give and take for sure. Depending on the size of the decision or what it is, from trivial stuff to actually life-changing events.
Right.
I mean, you got to think further out in the future sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I think that I think a good rule of thumb, and maybe this is what, because of, like we talked about in the first podcast, what you're going through, right, is that in times of high emotional.
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah.
That's really the baseline. That's the signal. That's the signpost to maybe pause, is in those times of high emotion when you feel emotional or super stressed or super worried or anxious or whatever it boils down to. I think that's your body's signal to say, hey, take a sec, think about this.
You should logically and analytically tell yourself, I'm under a high level of emotional stress or emotional, anxiety. And so, because, and I apologize if we talked about this before. I know we've talked about it before, but whether it was on the podcast or not, but you showed me a TED Talk where a psychologist was talking about broken hearts.
Right.
And long story short, he says, you cannot trust the way your brain thinks when you have a broken heart, because you're essentially going through withdrawals like a drug, and your brain will trick you, and you cannot always trust the way you think.
It wants to feed the addiction.
I think we
did talk about it.
Yeah. So that's the idea. If life's good and everything's rosy, I think trusting your instincts and not overanalyzing stuff is probably a safer bet.
Right.
But if you're in emotional heightened states, and you just trust your instincts, you're probably going to make things worse, right?
Yeah, we talked about it before. Your emotions, your thoughts lie to you all the time.
All the time,
All the time.
right?
Yeah.
So, questioning your actions.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. It's just interesting to see, and I think that's kind of where.
Well, you'll learn a lot about yourself, I think, on the inverse, the backwards motion of it. Like I said, well, why am I thinking this way, or why am I having these thoughts, or
It's a tough thing to do.
it is a really tough thing to do, and you're not gonna know. Well, not gonna know, but you won't always find quote unquote the answer.
Right.
But the idea of making it a practice, I think, is
Well, and talk about
paramount.
coincidences, right? And we've obviously discussed this before, but I kind of find this interesting what you just said, is because this morning I just happened to be, sometimes in the mornings when I'm doing, stretching, and I got back issues, so I'm always trying to stretch out my back and stuff like that. Sometimes I'll throw on some like motivational music or motivational speaker stuff from YouTube, right?
Yeah.
And a Tony Robbins clip came up, and I'm a big Tony Robbins fan, and it's a clip I've heard before, but it just reminded me of the same thing. And this goes back to something we were just saying a minute ago, where you're saying when you look back and go, why do I do this? And we made a reference a little bit ago about the kite strings. Okay. Kite strings is a concept that I picked up in a book called The Mandala of Being by Richard Moss. Great book. Okay. And the concept is this, is that, and what I heard today, the Tony Robbins clip I heard today echoes this. The concept of kite strings is that when we act or behave in a certain way in the current now, that's doesn't work for us. So it's the book kind of goes about what's working and what's not working for you. Okay.
Right.
So when something's not working for you and you have a certain behavior or tendency, that you can follow the kite stream back, and it might be back to something way early in childhood, but if you can follow the kite stream back to the event that made you decide, which is the whole Tony Robbins clip was talking about, at some point, if you say, oh, this is just how I am, I'm a smoker, that's how I am, I'm whatever, that's how I am.
No.
At some point, you made the decision to
Absolutely.
be that way because of, more than likely, an event or some sort of trauma or some sort of whatever it was that made you make that decision to be that way. And most of the times as adults, we made those decisions when we were really young. Long ago. And it's just who we think we are.
Right.
When it's not really who we are. At least that's what I think. So that's what's interesting about questioning your actions, looking back, questioning why. Because it's not as easy as just going, why? Because you may not be conscious of why.
No, you may not be. I'm afraid a lot of people aren't.
No. I mean, this is the thing. You might think you figured it out. So I've told you this before, had a thing I questioned why, followed the kite stream back, thought I figured out why. And then it wasn't until maybe a year later, all of a sudden a memory popped in my head of something that happened to me when I was really young, right? And I'm like, oh, that is for sure why.
Right.
So I mean, I think it takes a lot of patience and effort to, honestly, I think it's really hard for people to question why.
For sure it is. And honestly, for me, I don't even, not to say I don't care, but if I don't find the answer, fine. I don't find the answer.
Right.
And that's fine with me. Bring the awareness and bring the effort at least.
Create the space.
Try. Create the space. Challenge yourself.
Right. That's pay attention.
And that in itself will guide you.
Yeah. It's the awareness of it makes the difference.
Always.
Always makes the difference.
At least come out of your box.
Right.
Pop your head, flip those flaps open.
Yeah.
Peek your head out and start looking around.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Is come out of your box, poke your head up.
Yeah.
I like to think of it this way. This is an idea I had just for myself a few years back. If you're a little ping pong ball in a box. Okay? And that's all you know. It's like the whole fish in a fish bowl, right? If you're a ping pong ball in a box with no lid on it, right? And you need to see what's outside your box, what's outside your world. Fill that box with water. So fill that box with information, question things, learn things, to the point where now that ping pong ball has risen up enough where it has or is close to being able to overflow into the next box, because there's always a bigger box.
Always. Yep.
But it's that same idea is do whatever it is. And that might be that might be reading books, it might be listening to podcasts, it might be exercise, it might be changing your diet. You know what I mean? All
those be a ton
things.
Of things, yeah.
Yeah. But it ain't easy.
Hell no, it ain't easy. And you're not gonna be good at it.
No.
And you ain't gonna be perfect at it.
No.
And you sure as hell are gonna fall and slip.
And it's only for you. It's only for you. It's only a process for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I heard something on a podcast recently that I was like, yeah, no shit. Right? And they were talking about, it's funny too, because the guy talking about it is Jeff Garlin, who's, on the Goldbergs and Curb Your Enthusiasm. Yeah. Hilarious guy, right? And he was the topic of enlightenment came up, right? And the idea that he was like, there isn't like this little box that, that's enlightenment. He's like, who's to say that one guy's enlightenment isn't just, he's got a good life, can pay his bills, smokes a little weed on the weekends and just, takes naps on his couch, and that's enlightenment for him. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's all relative.
Well, is it working or is it not?
Yeah. Yeah. That's always what it boils down to, at least in my mind.
In my experience.
Is it not working?
Yeah.
So I don't know though, man, because what's tricky about that is we want to sometimes, especially with people close to us, we want to share what works for us with someone else.
Yeah. It's part of the human condition.
But a lot of times what's really going on there is your ego is like, I want to share it with them so they realize what's not working for them.
Right.
And it's human nature, I think, to be like that and to do that, but it's not this. It's so far away from the same for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Is it?
I guess I don't know. I guess I don't know for sure. I mean, straight up, I don't know.
Well, I had a conversation with someone today that I thought was really interesting. And he was bringing up how when it comes to, I can't remember what got us on this topic, but how sight and smell, like when something smells bad, most people will agree that smells bad.
Right.
Now you have the outliers that go, I think that smells great, right? Or most people will agree, this is red, that's blue, this is white. Even though it is subjective, because we don't really know. I don't really know how you see something. You hear a sound that's piercing to the ear, we can agree that is not a pleasant sound, right? So there's a programming that we all have to where, for the most part, we all agree on the same thing.
Right.
Yeah, that smells, that's too bright to look at, that's whatever.
Yeah.
But when he said that, I thought, but isn't it interesting how when it comes to emotions or interacting with people, how our perspectives just all of a sudden we're so similar when it comes to how we see and perceive our environment, when it comes to those things, our senses, but we're so different on how we perceive emotion, right? So two people can go through the same kind of thing or have the same simple thing happen on an airplane, baby's crying, one person wants to toss the baby out the window or scream at the parents, while the other person's like, it's just part of life, what's the big deal? You know what I mean? We're so different in how we handle and perceive things, but that goes back to what we're saying. I think that's all driven by the conditioning that we experienced when we were, young. So anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting. It's because we agree that things smell and,
Yeah.
So, but it's so different in how we experience the world. So how is questioning your actions going?
I'm human. That's a nice way of saying, yeah, I screw up.
Is it working?
Oh, it's working. It's working.
Would you say that it's working more than it's not working?
Absolutely.
Would you say that I'm Mr. Interviewing it. I'm leading you down a path. Would you say that you are you are finding yourself maybe saying things that keep you out of, for lack of a better phrase, keeping you out of trouble.
No, listen, I won't not say something to stay out of trouble. If it's what I want to say and it's honest and authentic in my emotion and so on, I'll say it. I got no problem being straight up about it.
But do you come back and go, I shouldn't have done that?
I guess it depends. I mean, yeah, sometimes, but if I'm, no, I mean, if this is working for me and this is the truth, is my honesty, as long as I'm being honest about it, then I don't want to sound like a dick and be like, well, I'm unapologetic about it, because, I do care how people, feel and stuff. But if I'm being honest, then whatever.
Okay, but let's get more specific. So going through a breakup sucks, right? So even if you feel that way and you're honest that way, there's got to be moments where you want to say something. And if you do, it's your truth, but there might be a wave of repercussions you got to deal with.
Right. Well, it may be my truth, but that doesn't mean it's the other person's truth.
Right.
And I respect the other person's truth, or try to as much as possible as well.
But so sometimes do you hold back your thoughts, or you're not your thoughts, but do you hold back and bite your tongue because?
Well, I mean, if I'm asked a pointed question, I'll answer it. But just to go right on a limb and say something because I feel it, no.
Hey,
no.
Listen.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, so
I
many
just
people
wanted to call up and tell you that. No,
but people do that.
Yeah, for sure, people do that.
We're all guilty of it.
Most definitely. But is it serving me or is it not? And most of the time, it won't.
Long term, most of the time, it doesn't serve you. Sometimes it seems to serve you in the moment.
It feels good. You get that high. You get that high for a second. Release.
That's that feeding the addiction.
Exactly.
In a way. Yeah.
But I'll tell you, I promise you, don't feed it, and it'll serve you much, much better in the long run of things.
Don't feed it. Because I feel like when you feed that monster, let's just call it a monster. When you feed that, it is digging deeper roots. So in future relationships, future situations, those weeds might pop up.
Yeah.
Right? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, no, cauterize them. It's, again, it comes back to allowing the space. And again, I'm not perfect. There's times, fire off that text or whatever it is and go, shit, that was stupid, a couple minutes down the road. But for the most part, try and, when that moment arises and you have that moment of whatever it might be, anger or resentment or, any of those fear-based emotions,
right?
Not firing it off, even though it doesn't give me that high temporarily that the ego's wanting, it created the space. So next time that comes around again, that thought is there, that space, instead of just reacting.
There's a buffer.
You have that buffer. And then again, you'll have that bigger buffer. And eventually it just serves you much better.
The reason I'm kind of like, I'm chuckling over here is because as you're telling me this, you're using the reference or the example of text messaging. And I've thought about this a lot. Because in a lot of ways, when we text people, it's disconnected us.
Oh, for sure.
Even though I just heard this not too long ago, studies show that because of text messaging, families are actually closer to each other because they can communicate that way. So I was thinking, one of the I don't know if there's a lot of pros to text messaging, because at some point it becomes very annoying and I hate it, right? Because it's like I just want to pick up the phone and call because it's just easier than sitting there trying to text, especially if you're not a fast typer. Right. But
it serves its purpose.
I mean, to be able to formulate what you're going to say. Do you know how many texts in highly emotional situations, do you know how many texts I've written? And by the time I formulate what I want to say and blah, 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 I don't even push send.
No. Yeah, for sure.
Because it's given me the time to kind of like cool down a little bit, even if it's a matter of 30 seconds that it took me to write the text. And then you're like, don't send this. So it's
the therapy in wanting to just release it. Whether that's actually received by anybody or not may not be the point.
Right.
It's like the old therapy lesson or trick of, sit down and write the letter.
Right.
Whether you send it or not, I guess is your decision to make. But chances are, by the time you're done writing it, you won't want to or need to send it.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And I know that definitely works. I'm sure that's probably, like you said, it's probably an exercise psychologist came up with
for
whatnot.
sure.
You ever heard of? It made me think of. It became very popular. I'm sure it's still around. You ever heard of Post Secret?
I can't say that I have.
So Post Secret is a website, and man, it's not for the faint of heart for sure. And what it is, and if I remember the story correctly, it was just a blog that somebody started, and what it was is that send a postcard in to this address, to this P.O. box, I think what it was, of your deepest, darkest secret, something that you need to get out there. So literally what the webpage was is you would go on there and see these letters and postcards that people had written and sent in of like I'm talking like my dad molested me as a child, blah, 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 blah,
Sure.
or I did this horrible thing that you don't know about, all anonymous.
Right.
It was so popular that it spawned a series of books. The archives became books that you could buy and read through, but it definitely is not for the faint of heart. There's some very dark stuff on there, but the whole thing, and I remember whether it was the guy who started it or someone affiliated with it, said that the amount of a lot of suicide stuff and whatnot, but then after time, it became so therapeutic for people just to read what people were saying.
Lets them know they're not alone.
Right. And so that's kind of like when you were saying it gives you that space and that time and the therapeutic process of putting it out there to where you don't need to send it.
And in a big picture thing, it's one of the main reasons we started this to begin with.
I was just going to say that.
I
was just going to say that.
We share very similar commonalities as humans, like the colors, the smells, and all those things. Our stories may vary very differently. They may be a big variety of stories, but break them down and you can relate to them. Right. And that's kind of why we started what we did.
Yeah, and getting guests in here to tell different stories across the board. I think, our first two guests.
You're not alone.
You're not alone. You're not alone. And this is stuff that I assume just through life and experiences, but I'm really interested at looking at the analytics of it, at really looking at after you've got, 20 different people we've had come in here, let's say, and just see, because we saw this in the first guest we had, Brody, right? We saw the reaction from people that listened to the podcast, not to us, but to Brody.
To Brody, yeah.
I mean,
that was
whether
awesome.
It was family members or friends or people that are acquaintances of his, or that reached out and said, thank you. My son's going through this. Thank you. This gave me a perspective of something I'm dealing with. And that's exactly what.
That job done.
Job done.
For real.
It's a cool thing.
Absolutely.
And I hope, and not just in that tragic aspect of things, but I'm hoping in the business aspect of things and just all parts of life, we can kind of go through that and have people on and people can go, oh yeah, I get that. Or, yeah.
And the humorous things, it doesn't always have to be heavy and,
I know.
Enlightened for the most part, even the humorous things and make people laugh.
And we'll get there.
Oh yeah.
We'll get there with having some funny guests on that tell some pretty humorous stories, So listen, let's wrap this up. But what I want to say real quick is, we just started the podcast, but right now, if you're listening to this podcast, you more than likely know us or someone who knows us, because we're not reaching the masses on any level. We did this, for kind of ourselves more than anything. But if you're listening to this podcast right now and you yourself have, an interesting story that you may want to share, even if you want to share it from a therapeutic point of view, or you want just to get it out there, hit us up on Facebook, shoot us an email, or if you know somebody that has an interesting story that you think might do good for other people to hear, just hit us up. Tell us, give us suggestions.
Absolutely.
That's exactly what we want to do. We want to get people engaged and involved and kind of contributing to this.
Enter as strangers.
Leave as friends.
That's right.
I think with that, we'll end it.
Cool.
All right, man.
Take it easy.